The sky hung low and heavy over the Texas plains, threatening rain that would turn dusty trails into rivers of mud. Jake Morrison pulled his weathered hat lower as he guided his horse through the increasingly treacherous terrain, the wind carrying distant thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself. He'd been checking fence lines since dawn, but the storm building overhead made him urge his mare, Dusty, toward higher ground. When the heavens opened in this part of Texas, they didn't hold back. The rain came down like bullets, cold and relentless, soaking Jake to the skin within minutes. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in stark detail. Through the storm's fury, Jake spotted his cabin in the distance, a modest structure sitting on a rise near Willow Creek, which was now roaring like an angry beast. Another flash of lightning revealed something that made his heart skip. There, huddled against a cottonwood tree near the swollen creek bank, was a figure in white. A woman, and she was in serious trouble. "Damn fool thing to do," Jake muttered, but he was already turning Dusty toward the creek. His mother hadn't raised him to leave anyone stranded in weather like this. As he drew closer, the lightning revealed details that made him question his eyes. The woman wore what appeared to be a wedding dress, once white, now mud-stained and waterlogged. Her dark hair hung in wet strands, and she shivered violently against the tree. "Ma'am," Jake called over the storm's roar as he dismounted. "You can't stay here. This whole area's going to be underwater." She looked up with wide, frightened eyes. Young, maybe 20, with delicate features that spoke of a genteel upbringing, tears mixed with rainwater on her cheeks. "I don't know where to go," she called back, barely audible. "My horse threw me when the thunder started." "What's your name, miss?" "Sarah. Sarah Collins." Jake could see she was on the verge of collapse, her lips blue with cold. Whatever had brought her out here in a wedding dress could wait. "Miss Collins, I'm Jake Morrison. I've got a cabin up on that ridge, warm and dry, but we need to move now." Sarah hesitated, conflict clear in her eyes. A strange man, middle of nowhere. He understood her fear, but the alternative was death. "I promise you'll be safe," Jake said, extending his hand. "I've got a sister about your age." Something in his tone convinced her. Sarah took his hand, and Jake helped her onto Dusty behind him. As they rode toward the cabin, he could feel her clinging to him, shivering violently. The cabin came into view as lightning split the sky again. Jake helped Sarah down and quickly led her inside, where he lit the oil lamp and stirred up the fireplace coals. Flames began to dance, filling the single room with warm light that revealed his modest but comfortable home. "Get out of that wet dress," Jake said, pulling a quilt from his bed. "I'll get some coffee started." Sarah stood dripping, still shivering. "I can't," she whispered. "All these buttons. My sister helped me into it." Jake's heart clenched with sympathy. He pulled out a clean flannel shirt and pants from his dresser. "These aren't much, but they're dry. There's a screen for privacy." Minutes later, Sarah emerged wearing his oversized clothes, looking like a different person. Color had returned to her cheeks, and though his shirt hung loose on her small frame, she was no longer the bedraggled figure from the creek. "Thank you," she said quietly, settling by the fire. "I don't know what would have happened." Jake poured coffee and handed her a cup. "What were you doing out there, Miss Collins?" Sarah stared into the flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I was supposed to be married today." "Supposed to be?" "To Marcus Redmond. Our families arranged it. He owns the largest ranch in 3 counties. She paused, sipping the coffee with shaking hands. "But when I was standing at that altar, looking at a man I barely knew, I just couldn't do it." Jake processed this. The Redmond family, powerful people with dangerous influence. Cross them and you'd find serious trouble. "So you ran?" "Right out of the church, in front of everyone. I just kept running until I reached my horse, then rode as hard as I could." Her haunted eyes met his. "I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't marry him." Outside, the storm continued, but inside, warmed by fire and coffee, Sarah's shivering had stopped. Jake saw strength beneath her vulnerability. "What will you do now?" Sarah shook her head. "I can't go home. My father will never forgive the embarrassment. And Marcus, he's not the kind of man who takes kindly to being humiliated." Jake felt a chill unrelated to the storm. He was beginning to understand the gravity of his situation. But looking at this brave woman who'd risked everything rather than live a lie, he knew he'd do the same again. As the night wore on, they sat by the fire sharing stories. Despite everything, Jake found himself drawn to Sarah's intelligence and spirit. She asked about his dreams of expanding his small holding, his love of the books lining his shelves. She told him about her passion for painting, her dream of seeing the ocean, dreams that would have died with marriage to Marcus Redmond. As dawn approached and the storm subsided, both knew their refuge was ending. Soon, they'd face the consequences of the choices that brought them together in this small cabin. Neither could imagine what would be waiting when the sun rose over the muddy Texas landscape. The first pale light of dawn crept through the cabin's single window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, where Jake and Sarah had spent the night in careful respectability. He on a bedroll by the dying fire, she wrapped in quilts on his bed. The storm had finally exhausted itself sometime before sunrise, leaving behind the steady drip of water from the eaves and the distant murmur of the swollen creek. Jake stirred first, his rancher's instincts pulling him from sleep as they had every morning for the past 10 years. But this morning was different. This morning there was a woman in his cabin, and the implications of that simple fact hit him like a physical blow as consciousness returned. Sarah was still sleeping, her dark hair spread across his pillow, one hand curled beneath her cheek. In the soft morning light, she looked younger somehow, more vulnerable than she had by firelight. The events of the previous night seemed almost dreamlike now. The storm, the rescue, the quiet conversations that had stretched into the early hours. Jake rose quietly, trying not to wake her, and moved to the window. The landscape outside was transformed. Where yesterday there had been dusty trails and dry creek beds, now there were puddles and streams of muddy water. The air was clean and cool, washed by the storm, and in the distance he could see steam rising from the wet earth as the sun began its work. It was then that he saw them. At first, Jake thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Through the morning mist, dark shapes moved along the main road that led to his cabin. Too many shapes, too deliberate in their movement to be cattle or wild horses. As the light grew stronger and the mist began to clear, the shapes resolved themselves into riders, perhaps a dozen of them, moving in a tight formation toward his property. Jake's blood ran cold. Even at this distance, there was something ominous about the group's approach. They rode with the purposeful determination of men on a mission, and that mission clearly involved his cabin. "Sarah," he said quietly, not wanting to alarm her but knowing she needed to wake up. "Sarah, we've got company coming." She stirred, blinking in confusion for a moment before the memory of where she was and why flooded back into her eyes. "What kind of company?" "The kind that's been looking for you all night, I'd guess." Jake moved away from the window and began pulling on his boots. "There's about a dozen riders headed this way, and they don't look like they're coming for a social visit." Sarah sat up quickly, the color draining from her face. "Oh God, they found me." As if in response to her words, the sound of hoofbeats reached the cabin, growing louder with each passing second. Jake moved to his rifle rack and took down his Winchester, checking to make sure it was loaded. He had no intention of starting a fight, but he'd learned long ago that in situations like this, it was better to be prepared. "Stay away from the windows," he told Sarah, as he moved to peer carefully around the edge of the curtain. The riders had formed a semicircle around the front of his cabin, effectively blocking any escape route. They sat their horses with the easy confidence of men accustomed to getting their way, and Jake recognized several faces among them. There was Thomas Collins, Sarah's father, a man Jake had seen in town but never spoken to, known for his strict adherence to social conventions and his quick temper. Beside him sat Marcus Redmond, still dressed in what appeared to be his wedding clothes from the previous day, his face dark with anger and humiliation, but it was the third man who made Jake's stomach clench with real fear. Samuel Pierce, the territory's federal marshal, was a hard man with a reputation for swift and often brutal justice. His presence here meant this wasn't just a family matter anymore, it was potentially a legal one. The rest of the group was made up of men Jake recognized as hands from both the Collins and Redmond ranches, all of them armed and looking like they'd been riding hard all night. Their faces were grim, eyes cold with the kind of anger that came from injured pride and family honor. "Jake Morrison!" Thomas Collins's voice rang out across the morning air, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We know she's in there. Send my daughter out and maybe we can discuss this like civilized men." Jake looked back at Sarah, who had gone pale as winter snow. She was gripping the quilt around herself so tightly, her knuckles were white, and he could see the fear in her eyes. Not just fear of her father's anger, but of what these men might assume had happened during the night. "What do you want to do?" Jake asked quietly. Sarah closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, Jake saw a steely determination that reminded him of why he'd been drawn to her in the first place. I have to face them. If I don't, they'll just break down the door, and that will make everything worse. Jake nodded, though every instinct told him to keep her inside where she was safe. He moved to the door but didn't open it yet. I'm going out first. Stay behind me, and whatever happens, don't let them separate us. These men are angry, and angry men don't always think clearly. When Jake opened the door and stepped onto his porch, the reaction from the assembled riders was immediate. Hands moved to gun butts, horses shifted restlessly, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees despite the warming sun. "Morrison," Marshal Pierce said, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority, "we're here about Sarah Collins. Her family's been looking for her all night." "Marshal," Jake replied, keeping his voice steady and respectful. "Miss Collins took shelter here during the storm. She was in danger of drowning or worse when I found her by the creek." "That's a touching story," Marcus Redmond spoke for the first time, his words dripping with sarcasm and barely controlled rage. "But it doesn't explain why my bride spent the night in a bachelor's cabin instead of coming home where she belonged." Jake felt his own anger begin to rise at the possessive way Redmond referred to Sarah, but he kept his voice level. "Your bride, as I understand it, made her own choice about that particular arrangement, and any decent man would be grateful she found shelter instead of dying in the storm." A murmur ran through the assembled men, and Jake could see several of them exchanging glances. The implication of his words was clear, that Redmond's concern was more about his wounded pride than Sarah's safety. "Watch your tongue, Morrison," Thomas Collins snapped. "You're talking about my daughter, and I won't have her reputation sullied by the likes of you." It was then that Sarah appeared in the doorway behind Jake, still wearing his oversized clothes, her hair loose around her shoulders. The sight of her sent a visible shockwave through the group of riders. Here was the proof they'd been looking for, a young woman clearly having spent the night in a man's home dressed in his clothes. "Papa," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tremor Jake could hear underneath. "I'm safe. Mr. Morrison helped me when I needed it most." "Get in the wagon, Sarah," her father commanded, gesturing to a buckboard that Jake hadn't noticed before, driven by one of the Collins hands. "We're going home, now." "I'm not going home," Sarah replied, and the simple statement fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock and anger among the assembled men. Marcus Redmond spurred his horse forward, stopping just short of the porch. "You are going home, and then you're going to marry me just like you promised. What happened yesterday was just wedding nerves. Everyone understands that." "No," Sarah said, stepping forward to stand beside Jake. "What happened yesterday was me realizing I can't marry a man I don't love, a man who sees me as nothing more than a piece of property to be acquired." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing, as if nature itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. It was Marshal Pierce who broke the silence. "Now, Miss Collins, you need to think carefully about what you're saying. There are legal implications here. Breach of promise, for one thing. Your father signed contracts." "I signed no contracts," Sarah interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "I made no promises of my own free will. If my father wants to honor some business arrangement he made, that's his choice. But I won't be bartered like livestock." Jake felt a surge of pride at her courage, even as he realized how much danger they were both in. These weren't men who were accustomed to being defied, especially not by a woman. "This is what comes of letting women read books and get ideas above their station," one of the ranch hands muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's enough," Jake said, his patience finally wearing thin. "Miss Collins is an adult, and she's made her choice. I suggest you all respect that and move on." "Respect?" Thomas Collins's face was turning red with rage. "You want us to respect the man who corrupted my daughter, who took advantage of her confusion and fear to—" "To what?" Jake interrupted, taking a step forward. "To give her shelter from a storm that could have killed her. To treat her with more respect in one night than you've apparently shown her in 20 years. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Jake knew he'd crossed a line, but he couldn't stand by and watch these men treat Sarah like she was something they owned. Marcus Redmond's hand moved to his gun. "You're going to pay for this, Morrison. Both of you. Nobody makes a fool of Marcus Redmond and gets away with it." "Are you threatening me, Redmond?" Jake's own hand moved closer to his rifle. "I'm promising you," Redmond replied, his eyes cold as winter stone. Marshal Pierce held up a hand. "That's enough, both of you. We're not going to solve this with guns." He turned his attention back to Sarah. "Miss Collins, I'm going to ask you one more time to come with your father. If you don't, I may have to consider other options." "What other options?" Sarah asked, though Jake could hear the fear creeping back into her voice. "Well," the marshal said slowly, "there's the matter of what exactly happened here last night. A young woman, alone with a man, staying overnight. There are laws about that sort of thing, especially when it involves someone who was supposed to be married to someone else." Jake felt the trap closing around them. In a community where reputation was everything and women's virtue was closely guarded, the implications of Sarah's presence in his cabin were potentially devastating for both of them. But as he looked at Sarah's face, saw the determination there mixed with fear, Jake made his choice. Whatever the consequences, he wouldn't let these men bully her into a life she didn't want. "Marshal," he said quietly, "I think you'd better be very careful about what you're implying about Miss Collins. She's done nothing wrong, and I won't stand by and watch her reputation be destroyed by men who are more concerned with their wounded pride than with justice." The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the mist and revealing the tableau in sharp detail. A small cabin surrounded by armed men, a woman caught between family loyalty and personal freedom, and a cowboy who had chosen to stand between her and the forces that would control her destiny. The confrontation was far from over, and everyone present knew that what happened next would change all their lives forever. The standoff stretched like a taut wire in the morning heat. 12 armed men sat their horses around his cabin, faces set in hard lines that spoke of violence barely held in check. Marshal Pierce shifted in his saddle. "Miss Collins, I'm going to count to 10. If you're not in that wagon by then, I'll have to arrest Mr. Morrison for kidnapping and corrupting a minor." "I'm 20 years old," Sarah said firmly. "Not a minor by any law I know of." "Old enough to know better then," Thomas Collins spat. "Sarah, you're coming home. This nonsense ends now." Jake stepped slightly in front of Sarah, his rifle held loose but ready. "She's made her choice, Collins. I suggest you respect it." Marcus Redmond laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Respect? From a dirt-poor cowpoke who can't even afford to fix the holes in his roof?" He gestured dismissively at Jake's modest cabin. "What can you offer her, Morrison? A life of struggle and poverty?" "I can offer her something you can't, Redmond," Jake replied quietly. "A choice." The words hit their mark. Redmond's face darkened, and his hand dropped to his gun butt. Several of his men followed suit, the metallic clicks of hammers being pulled back punctuating the morning air. "That's enough," Marshal Pierce commanded, but Jake could see the lawman's own hand resting on his weapon. "Morrison, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Stand aside and let the lady make a sensible decision." "I am making a sensible decision," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising strength. "For the first time in my life, I'm choosing my own path." "Your path?" Her father's voice cracked like a whip. "You think you know what's best? You're a foolish girl who's been reading too many romantic novels. This is the real world, Sarah. There are consequences to your actions." As if summoned by his words, more hoofbeats reached them from town. Jake's heart sank as he saw another group approaching, Reverend Matthews at their head, flanked by Doc Henley and store owner Samuel Webb. "Oh, Lord," Sarah whispered. "They've brought the whole town." Reverend Matthews rode up to the edge of the confrontation, his weathered face grave with concern. "Thomas, Marcus, I heard what happened. Surely we can resolve this without unpleasantness." "Stay out of this, preacher," Marcus snapped. "This is a family matter. When it involves one of my parishioners spending the night unchaperoned with a man, it becomes a community matter," the Reverend replied firmly. He looked directly at Sarah. "Child, you must see how this appears. Your reputation, your family's standing—" "My reputation," Sarah repeated, and Jake heard something break in her voice. "What about my life? What about what I want?" Doc Henley, a kind man who delivered Sarah 20 years ago, spurred his horse forward. "Sarah, honey, we all know you're upset about the wedding, but running off like this, it's not the answer. Come home, we'll figure something out." Jake watched Sarah's face as the old doctor spoke, saw the conflict warring in her eyes. These weren't strangers making demands. These were people who'd known her since birth, who cared about her in their own way. The weight of their collective disapproval was visibly wearing on her. "There's nothing to figure out," she said, but her voice was smaller now, less certain. "I can't marry Marcus, I won't." "You already gave your word," her father said, pressing what he saw as an advantage. "In front of God and this whole community." That means something, Sarah. Your word has to mean something. Jake felt Sarah falter beside him and knew he had to speak up. She never gave her word freely. You forced her into that engagement just like you're trying to force her into this marriage. Nobody asked you, Morrison, Marshal Pierce said coldly. In fact, I think it's time we discussed exactly what happened in that cabin last night. The implication hung heavy in the morning air. Jake felt his jaw clench as he realized what the marshal was suggesting and what the consequences could be if the community believed it. Nothing happened, Sarah said quickly, but Jake could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. Mr. Morrison was a perfect gentleman. He gave me dry clothes and a place to sleep. That's all. That's all? Marcus Redmond's voice was thick with disbelief and rage. A young woman spends the night alone with a strange man, wearing his clothes, and we're supposed to believe nothing happened? You're supposed to believe the truth, Jake said, his own anger finally beginning to show. But I guess that's too much to ask from a man who'd force a woman to marry him against her will. The insult struck home. Redmond's face went white with fury, and in one smooth motion he drew his pistol. That's enough. I won't be called a coward by some saddle tramp who steals other men's brides. The metallic sound of a dozen weapons being drawn filled the air. Jake brought his rifle up, knowing he was outnumbered but unwilling to back down. Sarah pressed close behind him, and he could feel her trembling. Stop! The voice that cut through the tension belonged to an unexpected source. Samuel Webb, the mild-mannered store owner who rarely raised his voice above a whisper. This is madness. We're talking about shooting each other over a misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding, Thomas Collins growled. My daughter's honor has been compromised, and there's only one way to fix it. And what way is that? Reverend Matthews asked, though Jake suspected the preacher already knew the answer. Marriage, Collins said simply. Morrison took her in, gave her shelter, spent the night alone with her. By the laws of decency and the customs of this community, he's obligated to marry her. Jake felt the world tilt around him. He'd been prepared for threats, for violence, even for arrest. But he hadn't anticipated this twist, being forced into marriage as a solution to the scandal. That's ridiculous, Sarah protested. You can't force someone to marry just because he compromised you, her father interrupted. Because he ruined your reputation and your chances of a respectable marriage? Yes, I can, and I will. Marshal Pierce nodded slowly. It's not uncommon in situations like this. The man takes responsibility for his actions, the woman's honor is restored, and everyone moves on. Jake looked at Sarah, saw the horror in her eyes at this new trap closing around them. She'd fled one forced marriage, only to find herself facing another. And if I refuse, Jake asked quietly, then you'll face charges for kidnapping and corruption of a minor, the marshal replied, plus breach of hospitality laws. Could be looking at 5 to 10 years in territorial prison. I told you I'm not a minor, Sarah said desperately. But you are a woman of good family, who was compromised while under a man's protection, Reverend Matthews said sadly. The law sees that differently than simple adultery. Jake felt the walls closing in around them. Every option seemed to lead to disaster, for Sarah, for himself, or for both of them. The assembled men sat their horses with the patience of predators, waiting to see which way their prey would try to run. But as Jake looked at Sarah's face, saw the despair and fear there, he realized that maybe there was another way to think about this. She'd risked everything to escape one prison. Maybe this could be a different kind of freedom. Sarah, he said quietly, turning to face her, what do you want to do? The question surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. In all the shouting and threatening, no one had actually asked her what she wanted. She looked at Jake for a long moment, studying his face. Then she glanced around at the circle of armed men, at her father's implacable expression, at Marcus Redmond's furious glare. When she spoke, her voice was steady again. I want to talk to Mr. Morrison. Alone. Absolutely not, her father snapped. You've done enough talking alone with him. 5 minutes, Sarah said, looking directly at Marshal Pierce. On the porch, in full view of everyone. Just let us discuss this like the adults you keep insisting we are. The marshal considered this, then nodded slowly. 5 minutes, but nobody moves out of sight. As the crowd of men settled back to wait, Jake and Sarah stepped to the far end of the porch. In the distance, the sun climbed higher over the Texas plains, promising another scorching day. But for now, in the shade of the cabin's overhang, there was a small pocket of privacy where two people could decide the course of their lives. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered. I never meant for this to happen to you." Jake studied her face, seeing the courage that had made her run from her first wedding, the intelligence that had made their conversations by the firelight so engaging, the vulnerability that made him want to protect her from the harsh realities of the world. "Maybe," he said quietly, "it doesn't have to be such a bad thing." And in that moment, as the morning heat began to build and the armed men waited for their decision, Jake Morrison realized that somewhere between finding a desperate woman by a storm-swollen creek and facing down her angry family, he'd begun to fall in love. In the shade of the porch, Jake and Sarah stood close enough to speak in whispers, while the armed men watched from the yard. The morning sun climbed higher, but neither seemed to notice the growing heat. "I won't let them force you into this," Sarah said quietly. "You saved my life. I won't let that kindness ruin yours." Jake studied her face, seeing the determination that had made her flee her first wedding. "What if it wouldn't ruin my life?" Sarah's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe this isn't the trap they think it is." Jake glanced toward the waiting men, then back to her. "Last night, talking by the fire, I haven't felt that way about anyone before. Like I could talk to you forever and never run out of things to say. Jake," Sarah's voice was barely audible, "I know it's crazy. We barely know each other, but sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of a long courtship." He took her hand, ignoring the murmurs from the watching crowd. "If we're going to be forced into this anyway, why not make it our choice?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "Are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking if you'd consider it, not because they're forcing us, but because we want to. Because maybe what started as shelter from a storm could become something more." Before Sarah could answer, her father's voice cut across the yard. "Time's up. Sarah, get in that wagon now." Sarah looked at Jake, then at the assembled men, then back at Jake. In that moment, he saw her make her decision. She stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "I'll marry him." A collective sigh seemed to rise from the crowd, though whether of relief or disappointment was hard to say. Marcus Redmond's face went white with rage, but Marshal Pierce nodded approvingly. "But," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "not because you're forcing us, because we choose to." Thomas Collins spurred his horse closer to the porch. "What difference does that make? You'll be married, and this scandal will be over." "The difference," Jake said, stepping beside Sarah, "is that we're making this decision as free adults, not as pawns in your games." He turned to Reverend Matthews. "Preacher, would you do us the honor?" The elderly minister looked surprised. "You want to be married now? Here?" "Why not?" Sarah said. "We have witnesses, we have a minister, and we have two people who've decided they want to spend their lives together." Marcus Redmond finally found his voice. "This is insane. Sarah, you can't be serious about marrying this nobody." Sarah looked at him with calm eyes. "I'm more serious about this than I ever was about marrying you, Marcus. At least Jake asked me what I wanted." The words hit their mark. Redmond's hand dropped to his gun, but Marshal Pierce was faster, his own weapon clearing leather in a smooth motion. "That's enough, Marcus. It's over. Accept it." For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Redmond slowly raised his hands, his face twisted with humiliation and rage. "This isn't over, Morrison," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot." "Yes, it is," Jake replied firmly. "Sarah's made her choice. Honor it." Reverend Matthews dismounted and approached the porch, pulling a worn Bible from his saddlebag. "If you're certain about this." "We are," Sarah said, taking Jake's hand. The ceremony was brief and simple, conducted on the porch of Jake's cabin with a circle of armed men as witnesses. Sarah wore Jake's oversized clothes, her hair still loose from the storm. Jake stood in his work clothes and muddy boots. It wasn't the wedding either of them had imagined, but as they spoke their vows in the morning sunlight, both felt the rightness of their choice. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed Sarah gently, sealing their union before God and the community that had tried to force it upon them. "Well," Marshal Pierce said, holstering his weapon, "I guess that settles that." Thomas Collins sat his horse in silence for a long moment, staring at his daughter. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with disappointment. "You've made your bed, Sarah. Don't come crying to me when you realize what you've done." "I won't," Sarah replied quietly, "because I know exactly what I've done. I've chosen my own life." As the crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others offering grudging congratulations, Jake and Sarah stood together on their porch, watching the dust settle on the road. "Any regrets?" Jake asked. Sarah looked at him, then at the simple cabin that was now her home, then back at the road where her father's wagon was disappearing into the distance. "None," she said firmly. "For the first time in my life, I feel truly free." Jake squeezed her hand. "It won't be easy. We don't have much, and there'll be talk in town for months." "Let them talk," Sarah said with a smile. "We know the truth. And besides, I'd rather face a hard life with someone who respects my choices than an easy one with someone who doesn't." As the sun climbed higher over the Texas plains, Jake and Sarah Morrison stood together on their porch, facing an uncertain future with the confidence that comes from making one's own choices. The storm had passed, the flood had receded, and in its wake, two people had found something worth fighting for. Their love story had begun with a desperate rescue in the dark of night, but it would continue in the bright light of day, built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the unshakable foundation of freedom freely chosen.